And I'm going to minimize. I'm gonna go through this presentation as soon as I can figure this out. It is important. Okay, so I need to share that up on the screen. This is gonna kind of give you some more information about all of the. I don't want 102. There we go. Sorry. Give me just a moment. Okay. So this information I'm going to talk to you about right now is related to that first chapter, but I'm going to give you maybe a little bit more insight that you might not have had before. That. Yeah, so this will kind of go along with it. So this just gives you extra information. How many of you have ever heard that in order to learn something, a lot of times you have to have it repeated multiple times in different ways? And so this will be one of those multiple times in different ways things. So all I'm asking you to do is listen and not play on your phones during this time while I'm going through the information. This will be somewhat interactive because I'll be asking you questions as we go. But this is just to kind of help out. So our purpose here is to go through and talk about the four main purposes of government. And we're also going to talk about where the concept or idea of government came in the first place. So first of all, when people have this class, they come into this class, they're like, why do we even need government? What's the whole purpose of this? I'm fine on my own. I can do my own thing. Most people kind of feel that way, especially when they're younger. And then actually some older people feel that way too. But they're a little jaded because they've lived life and they've seen people in government come and go. And sometimes they feel like they could do a better job. And maybe you guys feel the same way about running things. I mean, how many of you feel like you kind of run your life pretty good as it is right now? Anybody feel that way? Okay, a few people do, that's pretty good. That's important to be that way. That means you're probably independent, self-sufficient. If your parents were, had to go out of town on some job thing, you could probably take care of yourself for a few days, right? Okay, so basically, this is important to note. Government in and of itself can come in many different forms. It doesn't look the same way. If you go to foreign countries, you're going to find that their structure of government in those countries is completely different. You probably have been watching the news lately and been hearing about all the stuff going on in Afghanistan, right? We had been, over the last 20 years, trying to help Afghanistan create a government that was self-sustaining so that we could leave. Well, we were there for 20 years, and obviously we still didn't accomplish that goal, okay? So it's not easy to create a government that works. That's part of the reason why the United States has the longest running current government in the world, because it's hard. Running a country is not easy. All right, so let's talk about this state thing again. Remember that the concept of the state is the same thing as a country. The Greeks are the first people to really get into this concept of democracy and the people ruling through their government. One of those first people to really kind of get into this and talk about this is that Aristotle guy, okay? I don't have a picture of him, but the fact of the matter is He's a pretty famous dude in history. Now, in his work and what he talked about, he went in and talked about things like politics and democracy and what a republic would be. And we're going to kind of look at that. People say that we have a democracy here in the United States, but we don't have a pure democracy. So let me explain that to you. First of all, for there to be a pure or a true democracy, that means everybody underneath the government has a say in that government on a daily basis. Do we have that here in the United States? Like, do all of the adults in the United States get to be part of every decision that's made? No, it's impossible to do that. We have 330 million people roughly in the United States of America. There's no way you can put all those people together for any one decision. And that's why we elect officials to do that job for us. Okay. And so that's where this term republic comes from. We elect people to have the power and to make the decisions for us. Now, sometimes that works out really well. Sometimes that doesn't. I can guarantee you that if you asked your parents, do they like this person in government or do they like this other person in government? They probably won't both agree if you have both parents together and talking about the situation. There are some families where you might have somebody who thinks conservatively and somebody who thinks liberally when it comes to government, living in the same household, married together. They disagree on everything when it comes to politics, and that can happen. It gets into an argument every time. Yeah, I have relatives who think completely differently than I do too. It's actually kind of fun for me to talk about it. I'm not one of those people who like gets into like heated arguments, but I love to debate a little bit about it and see what they actually know. Some people don't handle it very well, and so they get into it really bad. It makes holidays a little interesting, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, the state, of course, when you talk about this concept of what a country or a state is, it says there's different things that it has to have. And we're going to go into these in a little bit more detail, but it says for you to have a country or a state, I'm going to use the word country because I think people will understand that better. You have to have a defined territory, which means that if you're going to have a defined territory, that means you have to have a border, right? Does the United States have a border? Yeah.
Usually it's each state.
And each state does as well. But yes, we have a defined border. We know where that border is. The foreign countries around us know where that border is. And right now, we're not at war with anybody at our border. However, one of our borders, we do have some issues at, and one of our borders, we don't. We have no issue with Canada in terms of a border, right? We don't have an issue where we have a whole bunch of Canadians trying to get into the United States, fleeing other countries.
Not because they like their country.
They like their country, but we do have a lot of Canadians who work in the United States. Most Canadians live within 50 miles of the United States border, which is pretty amazing. And a lot of them work in the United States. A lot of people in Hollywood are actually Canadian. We have a lot of people who just, let's say they live in Toronto or they live in London, Ontario, and they can cross the border and work in the United States. We have no issue with that because they go back home, right? They come in and work, they go back home, or they get a green card and they work in the United States. But Canadians don't generally, they're not fleeing anything. They're just looking for other opportunity. Now, at the Mexican border with the United States, we do have an issue where we have not really so much an issue as much with the Mexicans themselves, but with people from Central America coming to that Mexican border to try to get across because they're fleeing their countries. And so the border down where Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California are, it's a little bit more tenuous. And so what did we have to build there? We didn't necessarily have to, but we did build there. It's more of like a fence in most places. We call it a wall, but really, for the most part, it's a type of a fence in most places. There are some sections that are wall, but anybody know why that was constructed in the first place? And then, by the way, the wall and the fencing is pre-Trump, just so you know that.
Because
Okay.
they were trying to get in.
We had issues with a lot of things being done crossing the border illegally. Like in Mexico, they have a terrible time with drug running. Okay. They have drug cartels. And what was happening is that crime was spilling across the border into the United States. It still is, unfortunately. But that's why we started to put things up there, was to stop the illegal crime and drug trade that was going on. But now we have so many people trying to cross the border that some people think that it's necessary that we create a barrier to stop that. So, but we still have a border, and everybody knows where that border is.
Oh,
And
they have a
so,
lot of sex trafficking.
yeah, it's a lot of times those things go hand in hand, unfortunately. You also have to have a government that has sovereignty. That is one of your vocabulary terms. If you guys were going through the reading, the word sovereignty. Does anybody know what that word means?
You said sovereignty?
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
It's that word on the second to last line there, sovereignty. What that means is that actually means that you don't have to get permission from anybody else to make decisions.
Is it on?
Okay.
Page, people in government?
Let's see if I can find it in there.
It's basically on the same.
Yeah. It's in the second column of the second page. Sovereignty, and let me just read that too, means that a state has supreme and absolute authority over what happens inside their boundaries. So do we have to ask permission of Canada or Mexico when we need to make a decision about America? In America? No, we do not. Some other places, that's not always the case. And I'll talk to you about those later on. But we have sovereignty. We have the ability to make and enforce laws without anybody else telling us what to do.
Unless we were joining their country. That's different.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Now, the United States is one of many, many countries across the globe. And in fact, whether you know this or not, new countries pop up all the time. It's kind of crazy to think about this. The map, the globe that people a lot of times used to have in the classroom would become out of date like almost instantly. If you look in Africa, they have new states or new names for their countries being developed all the time. In South Africa, there was a place called Swaziland. It's inside of South Africa. It's like a little country within the country. Actually it's a kingdom, and they officially changed their name to something that starts with an E, and I can't even say it right now. But changes happen all the time. People get in conflicts with inside of a country, and sometimes they split. So luckily we don't have that situation here where we're worried about a split. However, we did at one point, right?
With who?
With ourselves. We had a civil war, right?
With ourselves.
And if it had gone any differently than it did, we might be two countries right now, if you want to think about it that way, right? But it didn't, thank goodness. And so we are one nation. However, a lot of times civil wars take place in lots of other countries, and they don't turn out that same way. Now, so you have countries like the United States of America. Then there's this term that's a little bit different, and it's the term nation. Okay? Nation and country are not necessarily the same thing. That term nation means people that they have to share something in common. Okay? So a lot of times it means that they're sharing a race. Does the United States have one race? No, we are a multiracial country, right?
Right.
We have people from probably every nationality around the world.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have a common language?
No, it's mainly English, but they have their own languages. So.
True. And that's actually changed more to the point that we don't necessarily have one common language. I would say if you were to think about maybe like the early 1800s, you could probably say that we probably did have more of just one language. However, even back then, you had people who were speaking German and people who were speaking French and different things like that. In Canada, they have a situation like kind of like we do now. We have English and we have Spanish as the two major languages in the United States. And depending upon where you live in the United States, you'll find Spanish much more prevalent than even here. Okay, but in Canada, they have another issue. They have two languages based upon their history as well. They speak English for the most part.
They got an accent to it.
Well, they definitely have that. You're right, but not as much as some other places, by the way. Canadians, their accent is really kind of small compared to like Australia or Ireland or something like that. But the other language that's spoken up there is French in a place called Quebec. And the reason that that's the way that it is because you'd have to study out their history to understand that the French were in control of that part of Canada. And we actually fought a war against the French when we were still underneath the British, called the French and Indian War. And we fought in that area. So there's language, but then there's customs, traditions, and religions.
Catholic.
So do we have like something consistent in any of those areas? Like, do we have one religion? No. Do we have customs that are all the same? That's the one thing where you may get closer to being true. You know, like there's traditions that we have in the United States of America, right? So like we celebrate our Independence Day, right? And we have all kinds of festivities around that. We have secular Christmas, which whether you're religious or not, a lot of people celebrate that, right? Of course, and give gifts and things like that with Christmas trees and stuff. That's all secular, not necessarily religious. And we do that with a lot of holidays. So we do that with Easter, right? With bunnies and candy and all that. We do Halloween. I mean, Halloween is huge in this country. So we do have some things that we have as kind of like traditions across the whole country. But we are not what I would consider to be a strong nation per se, because we don't have something that like, at least at this point, that really ties us all together, other than the concept of freedom. I'll just leave that there for just a moment. So the word nation is used to describe an independent state or a country. And then oftentimes if a nation and a country coexist, so like France, okay? If you were to go to France, you would find that the vast majority of people in France are what? French, okay? I mean, you would just find that to be the case. You will find that to be the case in some African nations as well, where they really truly are a nation state. Germany's a little tough because Austrians are also German. Okay, so it's a little bit different there. Spain, you'd probably say that about Spain. You'll find the vast majority of people in Spain are truly Spanish. And maybe even to a certain extent in England, you'd probably find that to be the case there too.
Can I use the restroom?
Yes. Let me do this real quick. Okay, now, in order for you to have a viable country, you got to have four things. You got to have people. If you don't have any people, you don't have a need for a government. Okay, I don't know if you guys have ever traveled through Missouri and noticed that sometimes you'll come across a town and it might have like just a handful of people. You still got to have at least two, really, because if you're gonna have a government with one person, then you got some problems. So you have to have at least two, but I've seen cities and things like that where they'll have like 35 people, little towns, where the mayor is everything. But you have to have people for you to have a country. You have to have territory with the borders or the boundaries. And those things are fixed, they don't change. They can though, and that's the scary part. And we've had lots of wars that were caused by territory conflict. And that happens in Africa an awful lot. And that's why a lot of times you'll have situations where countries will split into 2 or 3 sometimes. And it's pretty violent, not too good. It can also change though, because you negotiate with other countries or you can purchase land. That's how the United States was really developed, through those 3 things. We got land from war, we got land for purchase, and we got land from negotiating with different people. Inside your chapter, this section of chapter 1, there is a page that has a little chart or diagram of the United States and all of the different acquisitions that we've had. It's on page 7. And it starts with the original 13 colonies, but then it goes through and it basically shows how the United States expanded over time. And that's pretty interesting to look at and see how many different times the United States gained territory. And a lot of times it was through war, but sometimes we did it peacefully. Like, for instance, what's the largest state in the United States? Alaska. Texas is massive, but it's nothing compared to Alaska. Alaska is this huge state that nobody really knows a whole lot about unless you live there. But it's massive. I mean, it's truly massive. If you were to place Alaska on the 48 states, it would basically stretch from about Minnesota and the islands at the bottom almost to New Mexico. I mean, it's massive. It's so huge. We actually purchased Alaska from the Russians. Back in the day, they actually controlled that part of North America. And we bought it from them for just a few $1 million. At the time, it was still a lot of money, but we bought it. And we didn't have to fight anybody for it. Okay, so does everybody understand our borders? We have the Atlantic on one side. We have the Pacific on the other side. We have Canada, and that's spelled wrong. We have Canada, and we have Mexico. We actually share a couple of borders with Canada. We have, thank you. We have the Canadian border with the 48 states, and we have the Canadian border with Alaska. All right, sovereignty. Let's go back to that term real quick. Absolute authority within our territorial boundaries. And this is important to note. When you are a strong country, economically or militarily, you basically can throw your weight around in the international community, okay? We have probably, of all the countries on the earth, probably the most sovereignty, because we have the strongest military in the world, and we have the #1 economy, sort of now. I mean, it's changing. There's another country that's kind of beginning to take over in the economic field. Does anybody know what country that would be? China. China's economy is growing faster and faster and faster. We still have a larger economy, but their economy is growing faster than ours, and so there will be a point at which they overtake us and become the #1 world economy. And they have 4 times as many people as we do. So that kind of helps them do that. But with that power related to economics and military, it allows you to be able to influence other countries. So no, we're not gonna tell England what they can do inside their country. But when decisions are made on the international stage, we could do that. We could influence them. All right, let's talk about government for a minute. Oh, there's a picture of the territorial expansion of the United States over time. So if you look at that, it goes down to 18. That means there's been 18 different acquisitions of territory and over time. So we started with the 13 original colonies, and then we added some territory, basically the Ohio River Valley next, and then we got the Louisiana Purchase. Does anybody remember from middle school who we got the Louisiana Purchase from? We got it from France, specifically from this guy that everybody likes to say was short. I don't think he was short. I think he was pretty average, but we like to say he was short. He was this military guy that's really, really famous. Anybody know who that was? Napoleon. He was fighting wars against England and everybody else in Europe. And he had this big piece of territory that he really couldn't protect anyway over here in America. And he decided that he needed money more than anything. And so the French sold the Louisiana Purchase to us, which was basically the Missouri and Mississippi River valleys. And it's a huge amount of territory. It doubled the size of the United States in one fell swoop. And it includes what we now know of as Missouri, plus a whole bunch of other states. But there's a lot of different things there that you can look at as far as territorial acquisitions. Okay, now, where does government come from? Why do we need governments in the first place? What's the theory behind where government came from? Okay, there's 4 different theories. And so we're going to start with the first one. How many of you at home live with at least one of your parents? Okay. The family unit is really, really important. Okay. But they all look a little bit different. Let's go with the traditional family unit where you have 2 parents and kids underneath that, and sometimes you have grandparents and that sort of thing. Within each family, normally there's like a hierarchy of power or control or influence in families, right? Inside of a household, a lot of times, either the husband or the wife is the one who's like in charge, okay? And then the kids normally have to do things because you're not in charge, right? Like chores and that sort of thing, because there's a power structure within families. And this first theory, the evolutionary theory, would say that the family structure is kind of where this concept of government came from. Families work relatively decently. And so if families kind of work decently, then maybe what we could do is create what would be like a power system over everybody. That's where that kind of comes from. It's called evolutionary theory of government. Have any of you seen The Croods? It was a movie from a bunch of years ago, but it kind of shows you that power or that family structure and how that everything worked for them. There was the dad, and he was in charge of everything. He was the protector and made sure that they were okay. And then each of them had a role underneath of that. And everybody had to do their role in order for them to remain safe. Okay, that's kind of the evolutionary theory of government. The second one is called force theory. And basically that idea is that at some point, somebody who is like the big dog decided to take control. That kind of happens naturally. You guys know that happens in schools too, right? You got the people who think that they're all big and bad, and they want to be in charge of everything. That kind of happens in the student population. Happens all over the place. In countries where there's not a strong government, somebody is going to fill the void. In Afghanistan, that's what happens. Somebody's going to come in and take over, and it just so happens to be the Taliban, because the government there was so weak and didn't maintain the authority that they should have had. And we spent billions and billions of dollars to help them do that, and they couldn't do that. So the Taliban just came in and took over. That's basically force theory. Somebody will come in and take over. There's also this one, the divine right theory. This is the idea that God puts people in charge, gives them the right to hold the authority that they have. This usually works related to monarchs. Back in history, especially in Europe, they would have these people called absolute monarchs who basically claimed that God had put them in charge. And they, if you spoke out against them, then you were speaking out against God, and that was a terrible thing. But it was the idea that they were put in place by God in the church. Then the fourth theory is called social contract theory. And this is the idea that basically we give certain people power so that we can be safe. Okay. Have any of you, let me ask you this. This is kind of hard to get, but there are within a community, say Grandview, certain people who are in charge of keeping us safe. And we would technically call those people the police, right? Generally speaking, we just accept that they do their job for us because we need to feel safe. Anybody here not feel safe in your neighborhood? That's a bad situation to be in. And usually what that means when somebody doesn't feel safe, what it usually means is that you're willing to give up some of your freedoms to feel safe. It actually happens that way. Do you have a pastor anything? And so putting somebody in charge of a government over you means that you kind of gave up some of your freedoms in order to feel safe. But we all do that, right? I mean, think of it in your family. As a child in a family, you need a house over your head, right? You need food on the table for you to survive. And so within the family structure, generally speaking, you're like willing to do whatever your parents want you to do, as long as you have those things taken care of. So it's like your needs have to be taken care of. So that's basically the social contract theory. That's that situation where you're willing to do things for the government because the government's going to do something for you. Okay. Whoops. All right. Let's look at this social contract theory because this is kind of the idea of where our governmental system comes from. There are some people, these are the Enlightenment thinkers that I mentioned up in our I can statement for the week. These people came up with many of the ideas that are very important to our government today. So let's start with Thomas Hobbes. He kind of came up with that idea, the social contract. A contract is where you have two sides and it's an agreement about what each side is going to do. All right. So people give power to the state in exchange for that protection. If the government's not doing their job, though, people are going to be less willing to just sit there and abide by what they want them to do. So Thomas Hobbes came up with that social contract theory idea. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said this. He said, politics and morality are not separated. The state should be created to preserve freedom. That's an interesting concept. Do you remember when I said that the one thing that I really think, like generally speaking, unites Americans is the concept of freedom? I'm not sure you can say it as much anymore, but he said that politics and morality should not be separated. We have a problem in America today. When you think of politicians, what's one characteristic you think of when you think of politicians? Control, okay. Anything else? Lying? Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we've kind of lived up to this idea that politics and morality are interconnected or should be interconnected. Because our politicians, a lot of times, they lie, steal, and cheat, right? But he said that the country or the government should be created to preserve freedom. So that is something that was basically put into our original documents, at least. John Locke, another guy that's really, really important. He said that people could justify breaking that contract with the government if it failed to protect citizens' natural rights, which is life, liberty, and sometimes you'll hear it a different way. You'll hear it as the pursuit of happiness. But he would write life, liberty, and property. They're kind of interchangeable. So if the government can't protect these three things, then that contract that government has with you is null and void. Basically, he would say then that you can overthrow that government at that point. If they're not doing their job, you can get rid of them. That is part of the reason why the American colonists believed that they had the right to revolt against England, because they felt that that contract had been voided. Then you have this fourth guy, Baron de Montesquieu. He believed that governmental power should be divided into three separate units or branches, okay? And that's where the legislative, executive, and judicial parts of government, that idea came from. These guys, none of these guys are from America, okay? These guys lived in Europe. So what's interesting is that we were able to take the idea of Europeans and break away from a European country and then create our own government with their ideas, which is kind of interesting and kind of cool. There's the pictures of those four dudes, just so you have an idea of the time period and what they might have looked like. All right. I think I have them in the right order too. So Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. I think I have it correct.
What kind of name is that?
This would be French, I believe. That would be French, English, and English. Well, I think it's English. I think that's right. Now, so what should government do for us? We kind of talked about this in our journal entry the other day. We can basically put that into four major categories. Maintain social order. The way that the government does that is by passing laws, and then also by providing security through police forces and fire departments and things like that. So they maintain social order. One of the worst things that can happen to a city or town is for a huge fire to take place, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it totally destroys social order if you have this massive blaze that comes running through everything. And that's why fire departments is so important. Provide public services. Well, you can put police and fire back on those two things right there. Public services. Building roads. Having clean water. Having electricity, that sort of thing. Governments do that for us. Provide national security. That's the military. It's also maintaining that border. It's also doing keeping us safe from cyber attacks. Now, that's a pretty big thing. We're not doing a very good job of that, but that's a national security issue too. And then making economic decisions for us. They make treaties with other countries, like trade agreements and things like that, that either help or harm our economy. That's really important. So this kind of breaks it down a little bit further. Maintain social order. Without government, civilized life would not be possible. Have any of you ever had somebody break into your house? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty awful situation to be under. You weren't home, were you?
No, I was at school.
Thank goodness. But if there was no government, chances are we would have anarchy, which would basically be every person for themselves. And so you would probably not be able to have the things that you have and feel like you could keep them safe. Make and enforce laws. Our job is to pay taxes, serve in the military, and place limitations on certain things. Provide public services. Promote the general welfare. That's a good concept. Sewer services, safety of food. We talked about that. Driving tests. Can you imagine if just anybody could drive?
Oh my God, that'd be terrible.
I mean, there are times when, I don't know if you've ever, like, younger people and older people struggle with driving. Have you noticed that?
No, not
Younger people, because they're inexperienced, older people because they are not as good with reaction times and things like that because they're older. And if not for a driver's test when you're young and driver's test when you're older, sometimes people who shouldn't be driving can drive. It also means that, like, if you're one of those people who is in the habit of drunk driving,
Are you?
you can
using
lose your
those?
license as well. Right? So they have requirements related to driving that make it safer. Fixing roads and building bridges. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but we have all kinds of construction all over the roadways right now. Seems like that every year, but the fact of the matter is, if they didn't do that, can you imagine what the roads would look like if that happened? Because right now they're not very good, and if they didn't go and fix and patch roads, oh my goodness, we would probably be in serious trouble. You think so?
Oh, yeah, there's
Okay.
traffic there every day.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma.
Yeah, Missouri is notorious for having some of the worst roads in terms of potholes. I mean, truly, potholes are terrible in our state.
On the back road.
I was talking to somebody though the other night while I was Ubering, and they were saying that they were from Louisiana. They were up here for work about the same time that hurricane was just about to come through. And we were talking about potholes. It was like, yeah, we have the same problem. So I mean, I don't think it's just our issue, but
Terrible.
yeah, he said their roads were pretty bad. National security. One of the biggies for national security now is being able to protect us from terrorism. So it's not so much that we're worried about another country attacking us, but we're worried about just groups of people who don't like us or like what we stand for attacking. And so that's part of the reason why we were in Afghanistan to begin with. And over the last 20 years, we haven't really had a major terrorist attack in the United States. But now that we're gone from there, it'll be interesting to see what happens. The government handles relationships with other nations. They make treaties and trade agreements. I mentioned that before. And then they make economic decisions, like how do we keep our economy going? How do we make sure that people through this pandemic have what they need and can still survive? That's part of the reason why the government did those stimulus checks, was because they were very worried about people not having jobs and not having food on the table and not being able to buy anything. If people can't buy anything, our economy starts going straight down the toilet.
Gonna do this.
Now, there's another thing they have to be worried about, and that's controlling inflation. Because if prices skyrocket and you're not making any more money than you were before, you can't buy anything then either, right? So.
Why would they make like everything go up 50 cents a dollar? They're still making.
Yeah.
Like $10, $11.
That's the danger of it. And it's not that the government, they don't mandate inflation. Inflation happens naturally based upon certain things that are going on. And really it has to do a lot of times with supply and demand. So with this COVID-19 pandemic, we've had supply issues with lots of different things because people aren't working as much or can't work in certain industries. And so there's just not enough to go around. And so that starts causing prices to just rise like crazy in certain areas. So but they have to worry about that. They have to figure out how to fix that. So we'll see. Okay. I think that may be the last one. Okay. Let me turn this off.